In a small courtroom in Alabama, a racist police officer thought he had the perfect plan. He planted evidence against a black woman, confident she'd be just another name in the system. But what he didn't know was that this woman, Keisha Johnson, was no ordinary defendant. She was a CIA SEAL, trained in combat, intelligence, and survival. As the trial unfolded, the officer's lies began to unravel, and Keisha's true identity came to light. This is a story about justice, resilience, and the power of standing tall in the face of oppression. Get ready for a journey that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Keisha Johnson sat quietly in the defendant's chair, her hands resting calmly on the table. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Officer Brad Matthews, a veteran cop with a reputation for bending the rules, stood confidently at the witness stand. He had planted a bag of drugs in Keisha's car during a routine traffic stop, and now he was weaving a story of how she had resisted arrest and threatened him. Keisha, a 32-year-old fitness trainer, had been on her way home from work when she was pulled over. She knew the drill. Keep your hands visible, stay calm, don't give them a reason. But Brad had other plans. He had targeted her because of her race, assuming she'd be an easy target. What he didn't know was that Keisha had spent years training as a CIA operative, specializing in undercover missions and counterintelligence. As Brad testified, Keisha's lawyer, Marcus Reed, a young and determined public defender, cross-examined him. "Officer Matthews, you claim my client was in possession of illegal substances. Can you explain how you found these substances?" Brad smirked. "I saw her throw the bag under the seat when I approached the vehicle. It was clear as day." Keisha's heart raced, but she kept her composure. She knew the truth would come out. It had to. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Marcus continued his cross-examination. Keisha's eyes flicked to the jury, a diverse group of 12 individuals who held her fate in their hands. She could see the doubt in some of their eyes, the way they glanced at Brad with a mix of respect and fear. He was, after all, a decorated officer with years of service. But Keisha knew better. She had seen men like him before. Men who used their badges as shields for their bigotry. "Officer Matthews," Marcus began, his tone steady but sharp, "you stated that you saw my client throw a bag under her seat. Is that correct?" "Yes," Brad replied, his voice dripping with confidence. Marcus paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. "And yet, the dash cam footage from your patrol car shows no such movement. In fact, it shows my client sitting calmly with her hands on the steering wheel. How do you explain that?" Brad's jaw tightened. The angle might not have captured it. "She's quick." Keisha almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Quick? She had been trained to disarm armed assailants in under 3 seconds, but she hadn't moved an inch during the stop. She had followed protocol to the letter, knowing any misstep could be used against her. Marcus turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter the dash cam footage into evidence." The judge, a stern woman in her late 50s, nodded. "Proceed." As the footage played on the courtroom screen, the tension grew palpable. The video clearly showed Keisha sitting still, her hands visible at all times. There was no bag, no sudden movement, nothing to support Brad's claims. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Like I said, the angle shows everything, Officer Matthews," Marcus interrupted. "It shows my client cooperating fully. It also shows you reaching into your own pocket before approaching her vehicle. Care to explain that?" Brad's face flushed. "I was just adjusting my radio." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Your radio is on your shoulder, officer, not in your pocket." The room fell silent. Keisha could feel the tide turning, but she knew this was far from over. Brad was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. As the trial resumed the next day, Keisha arrived at the courthouse early. She wore a simple yet elegant suit, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She knew today would be pivotal. Marcus had spent the night reviewing the evidence, and he had a plan. "We're going to call you to the stand," he told her as they sat in the hallway. "But we need to be careful. Brad's already on edge, and if he senses we're onto him, he might try something reckless." Keisha nodded. "I'm ready." When her name was called, she walked to the stand with her head held high. The oath was administered, and Marcus began his questioning. "Ms. Johnson, can you tell the court what happened on the night of your arrest?" Keisha took a deep breath. "I was driving home from work when I was pulled over. Officer Matthews approached my car and asked for my license and registration. I handed them over without issue. He then asked me to step out of the vehicle, and I complied. That's when he claimed to find the drugs. Did you resist arrest or threaten him in any way?" "No," Keisha said firmly. "I did everything he asked." Marcus nodded. "Ms. Johnson, you mentioned you were on your way home from work. What do you do for a living?" "I'm a fitness trainer," she replied. "And before that?" Keisha hesitated. This was the moment she had been dreading. She had kept her past hidden for years, but now it was time to reveal the truth. "Before that, I was a CIA operative," she said, her voice steady. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Even the judge looked stunned. Brad's face turned pale. "A CIA operative?" Marcus repeated, feigning surprise. "Can you elaborate?" "I served as a SEAL for 6 years," Keisha explained. "I specialized in undercover missions and counterintelligence. I left the agency 2 years ago to start a new life." The room was silent as the weight of her words sank in. Brad's hands clenched into fists. He had underestimated her, and now his lies were unraveling faster than he could contain them. The revelation of Keisha's past sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Brad Matthews, now visibly sweating, leaned over to whisper to the prosecutor, a middle-aged man named Richard Hayes. Richard, who had been confident in his case, now looked uneasy. He had built his entire argument on Brad's testimony, and with Keisha's credibility as a former CIA operative, that foundation was crumbling. Marcus seized the moment. "Ms. Johnson, as a former CIA operative, you're trained to handle high-stress situations, correct?" "Yes," Keisha replied. "And you're trained to remain calm and composed, even under extreme pressure." "That's correct." "So, when Officer Matthews claims you resisted arrest and threatened him, does that align with your training and character?" Keisha shook her head. My training would never allow me to act in such a manner. I was taught to de-escalate situations, not provoke them." Marcus turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a decorated officer accusing a former CIA operative of resisting arrest, but the evidence, or lack thereof, tells a different story. Officer Matthews's credibility is in question, and so is the integrity of this case." Richard stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making speculative statements." The judge raised her hand. "Sustained. Mr. Reed, stick to the facts." Marcus nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." He turned back to Keisha. "Ms. Johnson, do you have any reason to believe Officer Matthews targeted you that night?" Keisha hesitated. She knew the answer, but saying it out loud would change everything. "Yes," she said finally. "I believe he targeted me because of my race." The courtroom erupted again. Brad shot up from his seat. "That's a lie." The judge slammed her gavel. "Order! Officer Matthews, sit down or I'll have you removed." Brad sat back down, his face red with anger. Keisha kept her gaze steady, refusing to back down. As the trial continued, Marcus called an expert witness to the stand, a forensic analyst named Dr. Emily Carter. Dr. Carter had reviewed the evidence, including the bag of drugs allegedly found in Keisha's car. "Dr. Carter," Marcus began, "can you explain your findings?" "Yes," Dr. Carter replied. "The bag of drugs submitted as evidence contains no fingerprints or DNA matching Ms. Johnson. However, it does contain traces of a substance commonly found in police evidence rooms." The room fell silent. Richard stood up. "Objection! This is irrelevant." The judge shook her head. "Overruled. Continue, Dr. Carter." Dr. Carter adjusted her glasses. "The substance is a chemical used to preserve evidence. It's not something a civilian would have access to." Marcus turned to the jury. "So, the drugs allegedly found in Miss Johnson's car were likely planted by someone with access to police evidence. Someone like Officer Matthews." Brad's face turned ashen. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Marcus pressed on. "Dr. Carter, is it possible that Officer Matthews planted the evidence to frame Ms. Johnson?" "Based on the evidence, yes, Doctor," Carter replied. The courtroom erupted once more. The judge slammed her gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order!" Keisha sat quietly, her heart pounding. She had known this day would come, but she hadn't expected it to feel so vindicating. The next day, the prosecution called Brad back to the stand. Richard Hayes knew he had to salvage the case, but Brad's confidence was shattered. "Officer Matthews," Richard began, "do you stand by your testimony?" Brad hesitated. "Yes." "And you maintain that Ms. Johnson resisted arrest and was in possession of illegal substances?" Brad glanced at Keisha, then at the jury. His hands trembled. I don't know." Richard's eyes whitened. "You don't know?" Brad took a deep breath. "I made a mistake. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed stunned. Marcus stood up. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss all charges against Ms. Johnson." The judge nodded. "Given the evidence and Officer Matthews' admission, I have no choice but to grant the motion. Ms. Johnson, you are free to go." Keisha felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew this wasn't over. Brad's actions had consequences, and she was determined to see justice served. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the judge dismissed the charges against Keisha. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their cameras flashing as Keisha stood tall, her face a mask of quiet triumph. Brad Matthews sat slumped in his chair, his once confident demeanor replaced by a hollow stare. The weight of his actions had finally caught up to him. As Keisha stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight felt warmer than usual, as if the world itself was celebrating her victory. Marcus walked beside her, a satisfied smile on his face. "You did it," he said. "You stood your ground, and the truth came out." Keisha nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. "This isn't over," she said. "Brad Matthews isn't the only one. There are others like him, and they need to be held accountable." Marcus frowned. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time to use my training for something bigger," Keisha replied. "I'm going to expose the corruption in this town, one officer at a time." The aftermath. Over the next few weeks, Keisha worked tirelessly to gather evidence against Brad and other officers involved in similar misconduct. Her CIA training gave her an edge, allowing her to uncover hidden records, track down witnesses, and piece together a pattern of systemic abuse. Meanwhile, Brad was suspended from the force pending an internal investigation. The media had a field day with the story, and public outrage grew as more details came to light. Protests erupted outside the police station, demanding justice for Keisha and others who had been wrongfully targeted. One evening, as Keisha sat at her kitchen table reviewing documents, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Marcus standing there, holding a folder. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, handing it to her. Keisha opened the folder and gasped. Inside were signed affidavits from several officers, confessing to their involvement in planting evidence and targeting minorities. "How did you get these?" she asked. Marcus smiled. "Let's just say your story inspired a few people to come forward." The final stand. With the evidence in hand, Keisha and Marcus presented their case to the district attorney. The DA, initially hesitant to take on the police department, had no choice but to act in the face of overwhelming public pressure. A grand jury was convened, and indictments were handed down against Brad and several other officers. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with Keisha at the center of it all. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, Keisha felt a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed. Brad and the others were sentenced to prison, and the police department was forced to implement sweeping reforms. A new beginning Keisha stood on the steps of the courthouse one last time, the sun setting behind her. Reporters shouted questions, but she ignored them, focusing instead on the crowd of supporters who had gathered to cheer her on. Marcus joined her, clapping her on the back. "You did it," he said. "You changed this town for the better." Keisha smiled. "Oh, we did it, and this is just the beginning." As she walked away, her head held high, Keisha knew her fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She had faced injustice head-on and emerged stronger, and she was ready to do it again. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales of resilience and justice. Hit the like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Together, we can shine a light on the stories that matter. Thank you for watching.